An invasion at the border. A crisis the likes of which we've never seen before. Drug smuggling, criminals, rapists, the Great Replacement. The way conservatives talk about the immigration debate, you'd think our country's borders were under siege by a swarm of armed militants as part of a massive plot to invade our country, rape our women, hook us on drugs, steal all our jobs, and have as many babies as possible in an attempt to wipe out the white race. And listen, there is a humanitarian crisis at our southern border, but the groups of women, children, fathers, kids, mucking through the dirt trying to seek safety, security, and jobs is a far cry from the militant throngs that conservatives would have us believe are staging a mass invasion and posing an existential threat to the American way of life. Study after study shows that immigrants are not the monsters the GOP would have us believe. But conservatives are backed by centuries of anti-immigrant fear-mongering that simply changes flavor depending on whichever group of immigrants is newest. Right now it's Latin Americans, but the rhetoric is nothing new. And conservatives have learned to harness it to continue their tried and true playbook of scaring the shit out of their base so they show up and vote, no matter what the facts or the data actually say. This is why conservatives are so obsessed with immigrants. Roll the intro. About you, but with the colder weather, I love eating nice, warm, delicious, comforting food. And fall flavors truly are my most favorite. They can't be beat. And with Factor, I can get the delicious, warm comfort food without spending time grocery shopping, cooking, or cleaning. Thank God. Thank you to my partner for this video, my favorite meal prep service, Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen meals straight to your doorstep. They have gourmet chefs creating each meal, and you can tell this isn't your grandma's frozen TV dinner. Recently, I tried this Chipotle rubbed pork chop, and it was so good. Like, if I had cooked this for myself, I would have been very proud of myself. Luckily though, I didn't have to, thanks to Factor. I love how many veggies are in this meal. It makes me feel confident that I'm getting all my veggies in. It's delicious, well seasoned, packed with flavor, and perfectly cooked. Tell me another way you can get all of that delivered directly to your doorstep and ready to eat in 2 minutes in the microwave. I'll tell you, you can't. Factor is it, folks. They offer 27 plus weekly meal options so you'll never get bored. And they have keto, vegan, and vegetarian options to fit your needs. The taste, the convenience, the flexibility. It can't be beat, especially because I can't be bothered to cook. Thanks to Factor, I don't have to, but I also get to eat delicious meals at the same time. This is a no-brainer. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks, Factor. For as long as immigration has existed in this country, there's been anti-immigrant sentiment. The first naturalization laws were actually straightforward and liberally allowed the entrance of immigrants into the country, in an effort, according to Thomas Jefferson, to produce rapid population by as great importations of foreigners as possible. That sentiment didn't last long, though. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were passed in the face of looming war with France, an effort to increase residency requirements to acquire national citizenship, allowing deportation of immigrants deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States or who were enemies of the nation, and limiting freedom of speech and criticism of the government. And that fear of immigrants as posing a threat to national security and our sense of nationhood has persisted. Throughout the 1800s, developments in Europe, including the Irish potato famine of 1845 and political revolutions, pushed numerous German and Irish Catholic immigrants to the United States, increasing the number of immigrants from 600,000 in the 1830s to 1.8 million a decade later. Nativists at the time, those in favor of limiting immigration, warned of wage competition, immigrant abuse of the welfare system, and religious clashes between the Catholic immigrants and mainly Protestant U.S. population. That was, of course, until the Civil War, which created high demand for workers in the war industries. So to encourage immigration, Lincoln passed the Homestead Act and the Contract Labor Act to offer land and jobs to qualified immigrants. Qualified being the key term here, giving rights only to free white people, but also notably to Africans and people of African descent. The passage of the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. But for decades, the federal government held the position that the 14th Amendment did not apply to certain immigrants, such as Chinese immigrants and their descendants, many of whom built the railroads and industry that allowed the United States to flourish in the 1800s. The strength of anti-Chinese sentiment is evident not only in Congress's interpretation of the 14th Amendment at the time, but also through the passage of the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted immigration of Chinese laborers workers and most Chinese women who were all assumed to be sex workers, and created general blanket bans on immigrants from China. In 1889, the Supreme Court's decision in 𝗖𝗎𝗡𝗡𝗧 versus United States supported this anti-immigrant sentiment, saying that Chinese laborer immigration was in numbers approaching the character of an Oriental invasion. Into the 1900s, nativists argued that immigrants impeded the American ability to achieve an ideal society. They committed crimes, abused the welfare system, and required that native-born Americans, white Americans that is, be protected from the lowering immigrant classes. It was during the turn of the 20th century when eugenics and race science took hold, with many scientists, academics, and doctors believing that certain ethnicities possessed immutable characteristics that prevented assimilation into American society, cherry-picking data to propose that immigrants from Northern and Western Europe were innately superior to those from Southern and Eastern Europe, ignoring the numerous Northern and Western Europeans who were criminals and depended on the welfare system. They administered so-called intelligence tests to prove the intellectual inferiority of Black Americans and new immigrants, intentionally including an overrepresentation of mentally handicapped people in their tests. This led to the passage of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which established for the first time caps, or quotas, on the number of immigrants from each region, favoring Western and Northern European immigrants and giving special exemptions for family members of U.S. citizens, with the assumption that the family member exemption would be mostly used by Western and Northern Europeans. And these laws were bipartisan and widely popular because of the pervasive nativist messaging that promoted nationalism, eugenics, and xenophobia. Statistician Francis A. Walker of MIT, who oversaw the 1870 and 1890 censuses, argued in favor of restricting immigration because immigration depressed the fertility of the native white population and resulted in the replacement of native by foreign elements, a sentiment that echoes the replacement theory rhetoric made popular today through conservative dog whistles. NYU sociologist 𝗪𝗓𝗡𝗪𝗡 wrote a book called The Melting Pot Mistake. State Senator Edwin E. Grant stated, "The prosperity made possible by our forefathers has lured the parasites of Europe, the scum that could have so well been eliminated from the melting pot." Economist Roy L. Garris reasoned that admitting Mexicans destroys the biological, social, and economic advantages to be secured from the restriction of immigration. Even though in the early 1900s the federal government classified Mexicans as white, the racial classifications we currently give to people is entirely an invention of the last few decades, let alone what they were talking about 100+ years ago. I recently read the book Fearing the Black Body about the racist origins of fat phobia, and in it, the author traces some of the history of race science and race-based classifications throughout the centuries, and at one point, Irish people were considered part of the same race as people from Africa, which adds further context to the racist fear-mongering during the height of the Irish immigration in the mid-1800s. Race, it turns out, is made up, and which people belong to subjugated races changes based on the flavor of the era. The U.S. Border Patrol is also a relatively new concept established in the 1924 Immigration Act. Louis Beam, a prominent white nationalist, helped train KKK members to implement the Klan Border Watch to target immigrants crossing the Texas-Mexico border, inspiring border vigilantes to this day. Due to these new laws and the economic downturn of the Great Depression, immigration plummeted in the 1930s. And then World War II came along, and it really complicated our views on immigration. In the years leading up to the war, nativists in the United States had controlled the conversation enough that very few Jewish refugees were allowed into the country. Hitler himself, Hitler, said, "It is a shameful example to observe today how the entire democratic world dissolves in tears of pity, but then, in spite of its obvious duty to help, closes its heart to the poor, tortured people." After the war, when the horrors of the Holocaust were discovered and the US had to face its role in turning its back on refugees, new laws were passed specifically pertaining to refugees seeking asylum in the United States. In the 1950s, the Bracero program created a simple pathway for Latin American immigrants to enter the country legally and obtain work, especially in the industrial and agricultural industries that needed low-wage labor. The creation of a simple pathway for legal entry meant that the number of removals and apprehensions at the border plummeted by 1955. A Border Patrol official at the time warned that if the Bracero program was ever repealed or a restriction placed on the number of Braceros allowed to enter the United States, we can look forward to a large increase in the number of illegal alien entrants into the United States. And of course, that very thing happened in 1964 when Congress canceled canceled the Bracero program in response to political pressure from labor unions, whose members were being undercut by cheap immigrant labor. As a result, illegal immigration surged again because Congress failed to replace the program with another guest worker visa program. Ending the Bracero program didn't end immigration into the United States, it simply made it illegal. Interestingly, during this time, many Republicans were actually in favor of immigration because of the cheap labor it provided for big business. The post-civil rights movement era saw a shift away from outwardly xenophobic language to a focus on numbers and population control. John Tanton, an ophthalmologist from Michigan who was also a eugenicist, pioneered the rise of using immigration as a political tactic to lobby Congress and get people to the polls. He founded a number of organizations that effectively lobbied and testified against immigration, including the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR, which still exists today. The organization website prides itself on not being a racist organization, it's just one that protects the US from the boogeyman of immigrants. Oh, and it just happens to have a eugenicist founder with ties to multiple white supremacist organizations. And with this increased attention on Washington and lobbying Congress came a number of immigration reform bills throughout the 80s and 90s. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 gave amnesty to certain groups of illegal immigrants and penalties for employers who hired undocumented immigrants, but did not create a way for low-wage migrants from Latin America to enter and work lawfully. So even though the act boosted the number of Border Patrol agents, illegal immigration continued to increase. The Immigration Act of 1990 increased the number of green cards issued in order to attempt to attract skilled immigrant workers. Still, illegal immigration continued to climb. The Clinton administration attempted to reduce this illegal immigration via border operations, such as Operation Hold the Line in 1993 and Operation Gatekeeper in 1994. Despite this, the illegal immigrant population in the US rose from 3.5 million in 1990 to 5.7 million in 1995. By 1997, the number of Border Patrol agents had doubled in the last decade, and this did nothing to slow illegal immigration. It simply made the process more expensive and dangerous to immigrants who were inclined to use and pay high fees to smugglers. By the presidency of George W. Bush, who had won in part by appealing to Hispanic voters through support of expanding legal immigration, a whole new immigrant threat was on our hands: Muslims. Congress passed the Patriot Act shortly after the 9/11 attacks, which reduced the rights of immigrants by expanding deportation powers and allowing the Attorney General to detain immigrants without charge or due process. In 2002, the Homeland Security Act consolidated 22 federal departments into the new Department of Homeland Security, creating Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Meaning that the current scheme for managing illegal immigration, ICE, is just 20 years old. Bush also signed the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002 and the Secure Fence Act of 2006, all in an effort to give the government as much power as possible to detain immigrants, often without due process or a trial. In 2012, Obama created DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, via executive order, granting a 2-year work permit and protection from deportation for certain undocumented immigrants. Despite this seemingly progressive stance on immigration, Obama's administration removed more illegal immigrants than any other administration on record, earning him the nickname Deporter-in-Chief. He deported about 3 million immigrants between 2009 and 2016, averaging far more per year than Trump, who in 2017 deported 295,000 immigrants, which was the lowest total in a year since 2006. This despite the constant anti-immigrant rhetoric Trump used to get elected. Trump's campaign and win in 2016 marked a mainstream popularization of anti-immigrant sentiment that had always been brewing there under the surface. As with many things we've talked about before, Trump said out loud the things that most people would only say in the shadows. The idea of a border crisis is a convenient scapegoat for the problems many of Trump's base have been feeling for a long time, including stagnating wages, growing wealth inequality, and a loss in job security. Decrying the influx of immigrants at the border for taking the things that are rightfully conferred on US citizens only, and thereby threatening their existence, has a great way of scaring the shit out of voters and getting them to the polls. Trump and his supporters also gleefully espouse the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which posits that illegal immigrants are flooding our borders as part of a scheme orchestrated by Jews and elites to import immigrants who will have more babies and replace white people with immigrant populations that generally tend to vote Democrat.
Latin American countries are changing election outcomes here by forcing demographic change on this country at a rate that American voters consistently say they don't want.
Our plan achieves two critical goals. First, it stops illegal immigration and fully secures the border. And second, it establishes a new legal immigration system that protects American wages, promotes American values, and attracts the best and brightest from all around the world.
This, of course, ignores the fact that a third of the Latino electorate voted for Trump in 2020. This is based on a longer-standing theory first developed in the early 20th century by French nationalist theorists. Then, in 1973, French author 𝗬𝗓𝗏, I don't speak French, he wrote a novel called The Camp of the Saints, an apocalypse story depicting the destruction of white Western society at the hands of mass immigration from the global South. And then American white supremacist groups read it in the 80s and 90s and were like, this guy is onto something. It remains a popular manifesto today for anti-immigration leaders like Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon. And in 2012, 𝗓𝗏𝗡𝗪𝗏, another Frenchman, wrote a book called The Great Replacement, in which he argues that white Europeans are being reverse colonized by black and brown immigrants, who are flooding the continent in what amounts to an extinction-level event. Since then, the term the Great Replacement has caught hold among fringe alt-right groups, who were then emboldened and brought into the mainstream by the strongly anti-immigrant rhetoric that Trump felt all too comfortable spouting off at every campaign rally.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these countries here?
These aren't people. These are animals. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
We're going to have our borders nice and strong. We're going to build the wall.
Build a wall.
We're going to build a wall. I'm going to build a wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it.
To the point where you have a mob of men in Charlottesville in 2017 screaming, "You will not replace us," in public. And in October of 2018, 11 congregants at a Pittsburgh synagogue were gunned down by a shooter who was motivated by his belief in the Great Replacement theory. And in August 2019, 23 people were gunned down at a Walmart in El Paso. The shooter specifically targeted Latino shoppers and referenced the Great Replacement theory and his fears of a Hispanic invasion of Texas in his manifesto. And despite this, despite the fact that people have been murdered because of the violent rhetoric surrounding the Great Replacement theory, pundits and politicians continue to tout it, including Tucker Carlson while he was still at Fox, with human trash bag Florida Representative Matt Gaetz tweeting, "Tucker Carlson is correct about replacement theory as he explains what is happening to America." And self-proclaimed white supremacists have rejoiced, with one announcing, now Tucker is name-dropping the Great Replacement theory on his broadcasts. That's due to us. And Trump's references to an invasion of immigrants are a handy dog whistle, as the rhetoric of invasions is popularly used, and has been for decades, as part of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. He plays into the fears even when he's not explicitly citing the theory. And as I've said over and over and over about every single conservative talking point I've examined, fear is the end goal here. Fear gets people to the polls. Fearful people are easier to manipulate and control. Fear also knows no reason or logic, allowing leaders not only to get more power and influence, but also to do so while spouting information that is easily disproved and clearly false. And it doesn't matter, because when you appeal to emotions, especially strong ones like fear and a sense of home and belonging, you can get people to do pretty much anything. Because the facts and the data simply do not support what conservatives are saying. And what's worrying is the fear is catching. So it's not just the alt-right or fringe groups or even just conservatives anymore who believe that immigrants pose an existential threat to this country. A 2022 NPR poll found that more than half of Americans say there's an invasion at the southern border of the United States. Studies have shown time and again that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes or be incarcerated than native-born Americans, but most Republican respondents to the poll believed the opposite. More than a third of all respondents believed that native-born Americans are being systematically replaced by immigrants. A large number of Americans believe that immigrants are the reason why fentanyl overdose deaths have increased in this country, even though there is no evidence directly linking them to the problem. And the vast majority of fentanyl is smuggled through official ports of entry by major drug cartels or other Americans and hidden in large trucks. In fact, Victor Manjarrez, a former Border Patrol sector chief, noted that virtually none of the drugs being smuggled into the U.S. are being smuggled by the migrants themselves. Despite this, 60% 90% of Republicans in that NPR poll said that most of the fentanyl entering the United States is smuggled by migrants. And of course, Republicans who got their news from Fox and conservative media were much more likely to believe the false narratives about immigrants and to believe in them more strongly. But it wasn't just Republicans who were buying into the anti-immigrant narrative. Current polling shows that support for immigrants and immigration reform that supports pathways for legal immigration is much lower than it was 4 years ago across the board. This can be attributed to the combination of economic downturn, which makes people particularly skittish and afraid of job insecurity, combined with the perception of chaos at the border. And despite the fact that the dramatic influx of immigrants after COVID restrictions were lifted didn't materialize to the extent anticipated by the media, coverage of border issues by the media, not just right-wing media, but most media, has led to the perception that there's an abnormal and threatening amount of chaos at the border right now. A Pew Research study found that the immigration crisis was one of the most heavily covered issues by the press in the early days of the Biden administration. And there is certainly chaos at the border, and many humanitarian, food, shelter, and legal representation crises happening at once. But it's not at the dramatic and dangerous scale that Fox News commentators would have you believe. According to Representative Gerald Connolly of Virginia, between December 2022 and January 2023, the number of border crossing encounters were cut in half. In 2021, net international migration into the United States increased by about 247,000 people, which is the lowest level of increase for any year since 2010, and about half the number of people who came into the country between 2019 and 2020 during the Trump presidency. Over 90% of fentanyl arrives at legal points of entry and is smuggled by Americans, while migrants accounted for less than 9% of fentanyl trafficking convictions in 2021, compared to 86% for Americans. Data released in February 2023 shows that 99.4% of immigrants monitored by ICE showed up to their court hearings. Only 0.6% did not show up for their hearings. An American Immigration Council report studying 11 years of data showed that 83% of all immigrants attended their hearings, and those who failed to appear often did not receive notice because of changing addresses, or they faced hardship and had trouble getting to court. These aren't the criminals skirting the law and running rampant that conservatives would have their constituents believe. So as I've established, conservatives are full of shit when it comes to the imminent threat of lawless immigrants stealing jobs. Much of the academic literature shows that natives and immigrants largely take different types of jobs, with some industries like seasonal farm work dominated almost entirely by immigrants doing work natives are not willing to do. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, foreign-born workers account for 18% of the civilian labor force, with Hispanic workers accounting for nearly 1/2 of that force. Foreign-born workers are more likely to be employed in the service industry, construction, maintenance, and transportation jobs. The great wage deflation or lack of jobs for white people that conservatives threaten as the natural outcome of immigration simply isn't happening, despite the fact that immigrant numbers have continuously grown for decades. The unemployment rate is at its lowest level in decades at 3.7% for native-born people and 3.4% for foreign-born people. The number of foreign-born people benefiting from the welfare system is minuscule compared to the number of white people who benefit from the system. The Cato Institute found that immigrants consumed 27% less welfare and entitlement benefits per capita than native-born Americans in 2020. The numbers simply do not add up to the horror story being told by conservatives. So what actually is happening at our southern border? Almost half of all migrants apprehended at the southern border are expelled back to Mexico. Nearly all are unarmed. Many have traveled thousands of miles through desert and rainforest and all types of weather to escape poverty, violence, and authoritarian governments, coming to the US border and turning themselves into border patrol, hoping to reunite with their families or gain asylum, employment, or other protections in the United States. They are overwhelmingly young people, children, mothers and fathers, and entire families trying to make their lives better. Many people lose their lives on the journey to our southern border. Many more people are trafficked by smugglers, robbed, raped because of their incredibly precarious position, traveling long distances with nothing but what they carry. Trump-era sanctions on some of the most vulnerable nations like Haiti and Venezuela simply pushed more people to the brink and encouraged more people to try to escape the conditions in their country and come to the United States. Trump-era provisions that cut funding for beds at processing centers have led to complete overwhelm at shelters for migrants along the border. The Department of Homeland Security manages the largest immigration detention system in the world and spends more on immigration enforcement than all other federal enforcement agencies combined. But 62% of immigration detention facilities are subcontracted to private prison companies, known for cutting corners to make as much profit off government dollars as possible. Immigration detention is a method for keeping track of immigrants as they go through deportation proceedings. It's based on the same correctional model as our prison system, and even managed by the same private companies who manage our prisons. But immigration proceedings are not criminal proceedings. I repeat, immigration proceedings are not criminal proceedings. 45% of illegal immigrants entered the country legally and overstayed their visa. That is not a crime. There is no provision in the US Criminal Code that provides for a criminal punishment for overstaying your visa. Deportation proceedings are administered by the Department of Homeland Security, an administrative agency, not the Department of Justice. These are civil proceedings. What this means is that thousands and thousands of people are being held against their will, with flimsy due process at best, in facilities that mimic jails in every way, despite not being accused of a crime and not being a part of the criminal justice system. Many times there hasn't even been a determination as to whether or not they're a flight risk. They're simply held in custody to keep track of them, or while they await a sponsor or other housing arrangement. Additionally, because these aren't criminal proceedings, immigrants facing deportation are not guaranteed representation. That guarantee only applies in criminal cases. More than half of all people facing immigration court proceedings are unrepresented, including 84% of those in detention. Children and unaccompanied minors make up over 2/3 of all immigration cases, and most of them are unrepresented in court. So there are literal children walking into court proceedings alone with no one to advocate for them. And many of the migrants being held in detention centers are in the United States to legally seek asylum. They're following all of the rules. They turn themselves in, and they are held in prisons while they move through the system, a system that is wildly backlogged. The data makes it clear that immigrants at the southern border do not pose a risk of committing crimes or even taking advantage of our welfare systems. Holding them in correctional facilities without due process would be unheard of in the criminal justice context, but has been normalized in the context of immigration to the point where we put children in cages rather than let them roam free. What's needed is not more detention centers or more Border Patrol agents. The shelters at the border where many migrants go while they wait transportation to reunite with family members or sponsors, or where they await their immigration hearings if they're not detained, or where they obtain social services, those shelters are absolutely overwhelmed and in need of more support. There are countries who don't operate on a detention-first model, where alternatives to detention programs are emphasized that are generally more humane and cost-effective than immigration detention. According to Human Rights Watch, governments should replace immigration detention with community-based case management programs that provide a holistic set of services, including access to legal aid and guidance on securing basic necessities such as housing and employment. And the US has tried some alternatives and found success with them, including under the US Family Case Management Program, in which ICE worked with community-based organizations that provided food, clothing, medical services, and referrals to other services. And these cost around $38 per family per day, compared with $319 per family per day for detention, with check-in compliance at 99.4%. Despite this program's success, the Trump administration gutted it. As has been shown over and over and over again throughout the history of this country, America has always attracted throngs of immigrants. Programs that have provided a comprehensive way to legally enter and work in this country have lowered the numbers of illegal immigrants and allowed millions to work and build a life for themselves here in a way that contributed to the fabric of this country. When those easier pathways for legal entry are removed, people continue to immigrate. They simply do so illegally, creating more regulatory difficulties and backlog. The boogeyman tales of immigrant criminals and foreign invasion do not hold up when the data is examined. And the crisis at the border involves due process violations and a lack of social services, not violent militants coming to wage war on the American way of life. If you liked this video, you might also like my video about why the US has so many prisoners. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, and Brett Piantek. If you're interested in behind-the-scenes content, access to my research and show notes, content about my dog, and all sorts of other stuff, consider joining me over on Patreon today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!